Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm going to be your host for this session of Cut the Crop. And today my guest is FAR Senior Field Researcher Charles Merfield, most commonly known as Merf. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Alison.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about fence line management and whether we should be looking at managing our fence lines in a different way as an approach to helping us manage herbicide-resistant weeds. So let's just talk about what we do at the moment, because most farmers will spray their fence lines to keep the weeds down.
Yep.
But actually, you're suggesting that we should be looking at what some of the other industries are doing and that maybe we should actually be looking at fence line management in a different way. So just talk us through the background to that.
Very good. Thank you, Alison. Yeah. So fence lines, and we're also including in this all those kind of uncropped areas that get sprayed, so the edge of driveways, those kinds of areas as well. And the primary issue here is herbicide resistance. Typically what's going on is we're spraying the same herbicides time and time again, and that typically tends to be glyphosate because it's cheap, it's broad spectrum. But as we've seen from the viticulture industry, where they've been in a position of using glyphosate almost exclusively for undervine weed control for many years now, because they decided to use only glyphosate because it was the least toxic herbicide they could use. There's now very widespread herbicide resistance to glyphosate amongst ryegrass and some other species as well, up and down the entire country. So, all the way from Northland, all the way down to central Otago, herbicide resistance to glyphosate and ryegrass is common on vineyards, up to 30% nationally. In Marlborough, it's 50% of vineyards. Half of vineyards have herbicide resistance, ryegrass on it. And we do not want glyphosate resistance of any kind in arable production. It's an absolutely essential herbicide for us. So we really need to start thinking about alternative ways of managing fence lines so we don't, because we do already have cases of herbicide resistance, almost certainly glyphosate, in fence lines in Canterbury. So this exists. This is not hypothetical. So we really need, as an industry, to start saying, right, yeah, we need to think about this much harder and start looking at alternative approaches.
Yeah. And so the alternative approaches, obviously you've got a physical strategy, and then you've also got a biological strategy.
Yep, absolutely. So I like to kind of divide these strategies up. The old toolboxes, the old cliche of the toolbox is physical approaches such as mowing or cultivation, biological approaches, which is basically filling the space up with good plants, as I like to call them, that are going to outcompete the weeds. And we still have chemical options, but we need to be a lot smarter with our chemical options.
Yeah. So let's talk through, because we're setting up a trial, a demonstration trial at Kowhai. Talk us through what you're doing there.
So what we're doing is it's very much a demonstration, and it's around getting people to think about what they are doing currently and what other ways they could do it, and ideally moving away from a chemical solution to either a physical or a biological solution. So we're kind of trying to get people to think. It's the main aim of the trial, and think of alternatives. And so in terms of the physical alternatives, we're using mowing, which is actually therefore a combination of biological and physical.
Yeah.
So the one of the big concerns in arable industry, in pasture seed production and vegetable seed production, is the same as the crop species existing in the fence line, and therefore contaminating the crop with pollen and or seeds.
Yeah.
And so a very simple solution is, when the plants in the fence line are producing pollen or seeds, to mow them beforehand. Then there is simply no risk of contamination. It's kind of really straightforward. And this is kind of linking back to the viticultural industry. They have a huge range of equipment that have been developed over the last 3-4 decades for doing things such as mowing underneath fence lines, cultivating underneath fence lines, because a vineyard row and a fence line is basically the same thing, a bunch of wires and posts and trunks in viticulture. So we're not actually demonstrating this at the Kowhai trial because we don't have easy access to the machinery, but there is cultivation. So if you want to have bare ground for some reason, although I don't think that's actually the smartest approach, there are plenty of machines out there on the market that will go and simply weed cultivate underneath your fence, right underneath the wires, and allow you to have that bare earth if that's essential to your production system. Yeah. And then moving on to the biological options, this is basically filling up that ecological space with good plants. And basically we're looking at something that's going to be competitive and outcompete, force out the plants we don't want, whether they're weeds in the general meaning or whether they're crop plants that could contaminate with pollen. But we're also looking to kind of get more benefits than that. FAR's been doing quite a lot of work with native plantings for supporting pollinators and beneficial insects. And it doesn't have to be, a big native planting taking up a load of space that can provide that. Simply putting the right species into the fence lines can also do that. And this is the kind of work that the late Steve Ratton at Lincoln University spent his entire career working on, putting resources, floral resources, lots of his cheesy acronyms like SNAP for shelter, nectar, pollen and alternative prey. So to me, those fence lines are really underutilized for boosting things like pollinators and beneficial insects that will then go out and pollinate our crops and control our crop pests.
Yeah. So how do you choose which beneficial plants to put where?
This is the challenging bit. I've started developing quite a long list of things to a kind of filter list. And it's one of the things that makes the biological options a bit more challenging because you do have to think of all these issues. So things such as make sure they're not toxic to stock. That's a good starting point. If they are palatable stock, they're not so palatable, the stock's going to eat them out. That ideally they would provide things like conservation biocontrol benefits. They need to be really competitive. They need to grow all year round. It's no use having something that's maybe deciduous and then a whole load of weeds and crop plants can get back in over the winter. Other things, fire risk.
Yes.
It's kind of things like that kind of, at the back of your mind. So we've drawn up quite an extensive list to kind of go, right, okay, what are all of these? And part of it is kind of like, could it be even an alternative crop? We had the suggestion at the research meeting, why not plant lavender? People farm lavender. They make some quite good money. It may not be practical to actually farm it, but hey, could you plant a fence line in lavender? Yeah. And it's nice and pretty and helps pollinators. Yeah. It's kind of like, there's lots of options out there if you think outside the box.
And I guess, have there been other industries who have done this and it's been successful?
Well, horticulture's, looking at this space. They don't have so much an issue with the fence lines themselves that we do as being in terms of contaminants of crop. A lot of them have traditionally also gone for that kind of tidy look and sprayed out the fence lines and mown, but certainly across the perennial crops, the orchards, the vineyards, they're now really reassessing this as well. As part of the Lighter Touch project, we were looking at arthropod pest control, so insect pest control, and we were using citrus as a model crop. And we kind of really went to town on that. We said, right, we're going to put 20 different species of pasture species, so clovers and grasses and legumes across the orchard floor, primarily to provide resources for beneficial insects. But we also said, hey, well, let's try and fix some nitrogen with some legumes and increase overall biodiversity. So this is now increasingly common across all the primary production sectors in New Zealand.
Yeah. I guess one of the challenges is also birds. Like, you don't necessarily want to attract birds to the fence line and then have them moving into the crop at, harvest time.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's then kind of going through that filter list. There's not so many herbaceous species, pasture species that are really attractive to birds. You'd be kind of thinking about woody species more. Yeah. And those that are producing edible seeds. So it's another thing we need to think about in there. But a bit lower down my list of concerns.
So what are the ones that we're looking at in the FAR trials? So
what we're looking at is we've got brown top. So that's a pasture species and a grass pasture species. It's well known. It's, occasionally is still grown for a seed crop, although it's not a major seed crop. Its advantage is it can grow well in low fertility situations. So typically we're not spreading fertilizer over the fence lines. So it'll have a competitive advantage. It's also stoloniferous. So if it gets some damage, it'll be able to repair itself. Next on the list is common or garden alyssum. It's kind of the thing that grows in a white ball, and it's kind of almost grandma garden kind of plant, But Steve Ratton found this was one of the most prolific plants for producing nectar and pollen to support beneficial insects. And it's as tough as old boots. I've seen it growing under macrocarpa hedges. Nothing grows under macrocarpa hedges. And it flowers all year round. So it seems to be really competitive in what I've observed. So it'd be interesting to see how that performs in our fence line in an agricultural situation rather than a garden situation.
And I guess the ultimate aim of both of those physical and biological strategies is to try and reduce the use of herbicides along the fence line and reduce the risk of herbicide resistance building up. And if you go overseas, to Europe and the UK, we see fence lines being managed in those ways. We've never seen that happening in New Zealand. There does seem to be a desire to have as clean fence lines as you possibly can. So we are talking about a behavioural change that would be needed.
Absolutely. And I kind of call this the tidy Kiwi syndrome. We have a certain expectation of how a farm should look. And yes, in Europe, this kind of herbicide use in many countries in Europe is illegal.
Yeah.
You simply cannot do it. There's even countries in Europe where regional councils, government bodies do not have access to herbicides. It's only people growing food. So, it's quite an unusual situation we find ourselves in here. So yes, to me, it's a lot of this is about mindset change and behavior change and kind of going, it's okay to not mow and spray your fence lines all the time. Indeed, from an economic point of view, a lot of this I call kind of recreational or cosmetic spraying. This is not adding to your bottom line, your profitability. It's just making your farm how you think it should be look. So if you took a really brutal economic analysis of this, you'd say most of this fence line and uncropped area spraying's actually a waste of time and money.
And creating a major herbicide resistance risk.
and on top. So it's kind of, if you start analysing this, quite clinically, this is quite an odd thing to do. This is actually, in many respects, for example, for annual weeds and pasture species, they cannot establish in existing vegetation. That's why when we want to establish a new crop, whether it's a crop of wheat or a pasture seed crop, we either go and spray everything off or we go and cultivate to create bare ground. So all this spraying in fence lines, ironically, is creating the perfect habitat for annual weeds and many pasture species as well. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot here. So there's kind of a lot of illogical behaviour almost. And it's kind of like, right, let's step back, have a breather, have a cup of tea, have a think and say, right, how do we do this smarter and make more money at the same time?
Yeah, and we do know that there are some growers, who are doing this. Is it something you think that is slowly becoming more acceptable? Or do you think that it's something where you actually have to go out and show a value proposition, based on robust science to be able to try and start making the change?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Yes, we have some leading growers who've been into things like biodiversity plantings for many years, and looked at their fence lines and stopped spraying many years ago and said, yeah, it's actually counterproductive. But also, yes, I think FAR needs to say, well, look, here's a bunch of approaches. This may not be the best solution for your farm. It's not like when we do a herbicide trial for in crop or a fungicide trial in crop, we can give you very specific recommendations. This is more about making you think and saying, yep, this is perfectly good way of managing your fence lines. particularly around costs and particularly around herbicide resistance.
And we, of course, have done biodiversity plantings at Chertsey around the fence lines.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yes, I mean, they're nicely well established now. And part of the conversation we're having is, well, we've got these established. We can stop spraying underneath them. You know, typically woody species, you spray for 2 or 3 years to make sure they're established. And at that point, you just go, right, shut the gate, walk away.
Yeah.
Let the ecology do its work.
So what would be the reason why people would not want to do this?
I think it's essential everybody does do this. You know, even if you're continuing using the chemistry, just spraying the same mode of action or the same active ingredient like glyphosate time and time again is pretty much guaranteed to have you develop herbicide or select herbicide resistance, which you're then going to have to deal with in your crop.
Yeah.
You know, you do not want herbicide resistance in your crop. You need to look after your herbicides. You know, herbicide resistance is very much a farm by farm issue, even by paddock issue. So if you've got this, you can't blame the neighbours. It's your fault of how you were using your herbicides.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to lose herbicides, you need to manage them properly and look after them. And one of the simplest first steps, stop spraying Roundup in the fence line all the time.
Yeah.
It's really simple.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's so simple and it seems so logical that invariably people will think that there must be a fish hook somewhere. And I guess that's why FAR needs to have these demonstration trials so we can say, well, look, this is what we've done. This is the rationale, and this is what's happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of ironic, kind of a lot of the stuff arable farmers are facing, there's technical complexity or it's going to cost money. There are no fish hooks in this. It's really simple. It's almost just stop spraying the fence line. Yeah. That's as simple as it can get. And maybe you need to mow it when your seed crops are being pollinated. Just a few simple things like that. There are no big fish hooks in the background on this one.
Yeah. Okay, great. Any other last comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, the old, if you are using herbicides for weed management, the golden rules. I have to say the golden rules. Never, ever apply the same AI or the same mode of action repeatedly. That is the most effective way to select for resistance. The solution is to mix things up. So the first step is to create a tank mix of different modes of action and then use that repeatedly. Better is to actually use a sequence of different modes of action. And you get to the kind of the full Monty, and this is where you have a sequence of different mixtures, which is slightly head spinning, but essentially what we're doing at the Kowhai demonstration farm is we're using a knockdown herbicide to clear any existing vegetation, and then we're using a residual. And using residuals is really important in resistance management, including in cereal crops. And so alternating between a knockdown and a residual, but then also the modes of action of those knockdowns and residuals will change every time we apply them. Yeah. And we have a list of about 6 in each. So it's a really thing. Basically mix up your mode of actions.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, Merf.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.